Welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast, a platform dedicated to uncuffing your true potential in public safety. We're here to provide you with valuable tips and insights that will help you optimize your life and career. I'm retired Chief Patrick Flanley, and I'm honored to be your guide and coach on this journey. Here, I'll share the latest insights and strategies to help you survive and thrive in the demanding world of public safety. Our noble duty is to protect and serve. We embody the role of peacemakers in our communities. However, this profession's immense physical and mental demands come with a price. If we fail to take a proactive approach for our well-being and lead ourselves first, then the stress from the job can and will lead to poor health outcomes. We have all seen it play out. Not only does this impact our professional and personal lives, but it also affects our ability to fulfill this sacred duty. Like many of you, my journey has been filled with tremendous challenges, with highs and lows. However, through creativity, experience, and a positive attitude, I successfully managed over 30 years in law enforcement, emerging healthy and happy. Now, I am driven to share what I've learned to show you that the path is not all doom and gloom. There is hope and a profound purpose in serving your community, and I'm here to show you that it does not have to come at the cost of your health and well-being. Join us as we explore cutting-edge research, interview top experts, and share inspiring stories of transformation. Whether on duty or off, it's time to optimize your potential and live your best life. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered. This is the Coptimizer Podcast. Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I've got Glenn Norling. I love saying this, special agent from the FBI, retired.
We're all very special. So.
Yes, very special, very special. But you are a special guest, and I do appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us today. You've got an amazing backstory, just an incredible experience. Gotten to know you a little bit over the past few months. We got to meet in person a few weeks ago when we were presenting down at Lucas Oil Stadium at the security conference, that was really cool. But without further ado, sir, can you just give the audience a little introduction about who Glenn is and what your background is, and we'll work our way towards active shooter response. Just a little teaser, folks.
Absolutely. And Chief, it's a pleasure to get back together with you again. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast here. So a little bit about Glenn. Where do you start, right? Well, I have to say, I have always been the preparedness. I started out as the preparedness kid. I'm the preparedness guy. I'm all about that. And, my background, I grew up in Ohio. My father was older. My parents got married. My dad was 48. My mom was 24. He was 56 when I came along. So he had been in World War II. He spent 18 years in the Army, way before I had ever been born. But when I was growing up, he was a reserve deputy sheriff. He ran the Reserve Corps. So some of my earliest memories from law enforcement were 5 or 6 Harleys come roaring up the driveway to, my dad's Reserve Corps buddies coming up to visit him. And then when I was in high school, my dad was a police officer in small town where I grew up, town of 5,000, had 16 sworn officers. So I rode to high school most of my senior year, was dropped off in the cruiser. This is back in the 80s. So this is a while ago. So I've been around law enforcement, and that's kind of woven its way throughout my entire life. I was very interested. Boy Scouts was my big thing as a teenager. So, I earned my Eagle rank, did a bunch of stuff other than that. And it gave me so many different opportunities. So after I'd earned my Eagle, I had an opportunity to have a job sponsor, and that happened to be a special agent, Harry Wilson of the FBI in the Youngstown, Ohio resident agency, which is kind of a set, the resident agencies or satellite offices. So I got to spend the day with Agent Wilson at 14, and I came back to that eventually, as you'll see. I'm very interested in science, Boy Scouts and science. Those are my two things. So I went off to college, got my degree. It was very science oriented at that point. My bachelor's is in physics, and my brain got tired after I did that. As so, I always knew I'd be going into the military at some point. I went through Air Force ROTC at college, got commissioned as a second lieutenant, brand new butter bar, and into the Air Force. And I was
Ohio
assigned as an
Bobcat, though, right? You're an Ohio
yes, Ohio
Bobcat.
University of Bobcats. Very good.
Yeah.
Not many people know that. So,
Well, you know
uh,
what? My good friend Tom Schott is a fellow Bobcat. So shout out to
there you
Tom
go.
and all the Bobcats out there. At least you're
Well,
not
there
a
you go.
Buckeye. Well, you probably are an Ohio State Buckeye fan, but
Well, I was kind of betwixt and between. And say, in my first, when I was commissioned in the Air Force, my first duty assignment was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
yeah.
Which was good. I was close to home. So I became an acquisition officer. So we bought weapon systems essentially for the Air Force. Thankfully, I didn't go out and buy the $600 toilet seats or those kind of things. But I was lucky enough to be assigned into what's called a system program office. The first one I worked in was this. It was a system called Lantern, which of course is a military acronym for something. But essentially, it's two pods that hung off the bottom of F-15E, the Strike Eagle, and F-15C and D models that allow them to fight through the weather, fight at night, fight through smoke and haze, and do laser designating. So they used a fair amount of that in Desert Storm. So I spent a couple years doing that. Then I moved over out to Hill Air Force Base in Utah, where I figured out, kid growing up in Ohio, going to college in Ohio, being in Ohio. When I got to Utah, I figured out you can actually have blue sky and snow at the same time. Who knew? I didn't see that so much in Ohio. I venture to say Indiana is probably the same, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
So that was, but I had a great time there. I was assigned to work on helicopter simulators. So all the Air Force's special ops helicopters, we got to train the pilots on and everything like that. So that gave me some great opportunities. But what I found, even through college and into there, in college, I actually worked part-time for the university, but I worked closely with the police department. So we actually kind of patrol the residential areas. And even back then, after our shift was over at 4 o'clock in the morning, oftentimes I would jump in the Ohio University Police Department cruiser with one of the officers and go to the end of his shift about 7 in the morning. And I figure that the statute of limitations is gone for both Don Combs and I for that. So I think we're good. But I'm pretty sure I wasn't able to do that as a student. But I always kept coming back to that. And in the Air Force, I would always end up talking to OSI agents, Office of Special Investigations, Air Force's version of the FBI, or security forces folks. And I'd been in 10 years. I loved what I did. I was a pretty senior captain at the point I was making my decision. Of course, the FBI is mandatory retirement at 57. So I was 33 at the time, and okay, if I stay for my majors board, I'm going to be too old to try. So with the support of my wife, and I met my wife through the Air Force, she was active duty as well, said, okay, let's try for the FBI. And so 18-month application process. This was back in kind of the stubby pencil era of
Yeah.
the 1990s. I filled out the 4-page application. And if you pass that, you got on to the next phase. And so 18 months, had to apply. I had to tell the Air Force I was leaving 6 months before I did, which there was a little period of angst there because I didn't yet have a class assigned, an FBI Academy class assigned. So there were a few weeks there I was like, well, I'm hoping for that letter, right?
Yeah.
But as it was, I got out of the Air Force the 26th of January of the year 2000, and I started at the FBI Academy the 11th of February. So that all worked out well. And then spent 20 years in the FBI, and poof, how that happened. And then that's even been a few years ago now. So I started out in the Sacramento division, did domestic terrorism investigations for 6 years. From there, during that time, I also worked in the crisis management program. That's kind of where we end up from there to here. So from there, I went back to Quantico. Spent 2 years as a supervisor in the crisis management unit in our critical incident response group. From there, I moved out to Portland. I supervised the violent crime squad in Portland for 4 years, and then had a rare opportunity to move up to the mountains. So I was able to transfer from Portland to South Lake Tahoe, California, where there's actually a 2-agent office up here. Had 6 counties, two of us on the California side, 10,000 square miles of coverage, 12 ski resorts in our territory. So not a bad gig to be up here in the mountains. And then we
Yeah.
live up here still
That's
right now. I retired. Go
probably a
good.
coveted RA is what I was thinking.
There are very few RAs around the Bureau that are up in the mountains. Durango, Colorado is another one. Tahoe, you've got a couple. Colorado Springs is a little bit bigger office, but really, really so few. And it's just, of course, it's incredible territory. You have a bunch of small agents, and I really embraced working with the smaller agencies. Here's resources the Bureau can bring to bear. Here's, partners. I'm out there, every day talking to the officers, deputies. They're some of my best friends now. And I developed such a close relationship when I retired. One of the things I do, because I never really intended to retire. I was, this is Bean, one of our black cat kind of walking by. I warned you she might make an appearance. This is Bean, say hi. So, but I developed such a close relationship with them. I work for them part time now. I do their background investigations for new cops, new firefighters actually come into the city as well. So that's I love the RA work. Of course, I love the territory around here, but I loved working with agencies and being, when the phone would ring at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was the bureau. So I really embraced that relationship with them. So retired after 20 years in the bureau. I'd been in the federal government 30 years. So in 2020, like, yeah, I'm ready for a change. They were going to kick me out in another 3 years at that point, anyhow. So I was lucky enough since about 2013, when the Bureau, about a year after Sandy Hook, when the Bureau started reaching out to, we want to be more proactive in educating chiefs and sheriffs about, here's how to manage critical incidents. We wanted to talk about the behavioral analysis resources the Bureau can offer around the country. So I would do the crisis management, the command post management portion of those briefings. And then after that, it very quickly morphed into reaching out and talking to non-law enforcement folks about how to prepare, what to do in the event of an active shooter event. And I was lucky enough. I had certainly had caseload here, but I had the support of the special agent in charge to really travel throughout our division, which was 36 counties here in California, talking about active shooter preparedness, active shooter awareness. And I developed, a program to actually reach out and talk to people. And I saw a huge reward in that. I saw a huge reward in talking to a school teacher who'd never been involved in a violent incident, or never wanted to, or didn't really know what to do. And that level of empowerment of knowledge, I got a huge return on that. So I did that as probably 70% of my workload for my last 5 or 6 years in the bureau. And, like, this is something I want to continue to do, because I see huge value in it. And I've had, little expertise, or little experience with doing that. And I love sharing that message. So I never really intended to retire. It was time for career number 3 for Glenn. So right when I retired, I founded it's TBR Consulting, which stands for Train Be Ready, and did exactly the same thing. I was the crisis management, I was the command post nerd. I enjoyed training cops how to deal with command posts, how to deal with critical investigations, like we did in the bureau, from child abductions to violent incidents, and do a little bit of everything. I love the training exercises. I love putting those together. I love reaching and training people on what to do to empower them mentally. We talk about mindset, situation awareness, all those kind of things. And I've trained almost over 30,000 people by this time, and I love doing it. And that's kind of what led me into connecting eventually with Chris Grolnick at the Active Shooter Prevention Project, and I'm the executive director for that now. And Chris and I are like brothers from another mother. We've got the same barber, all that fits. So the Marine and the Air Force guy actually get along well together. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to do what I was doing within kind of a regional reach to a global reach. So that's probably way more than you wanted, but that is at the heart of Glenn. I am at the heart of everything. I'm a Boy Scout, and I'm the preparedness guy. So how's that for a lengthy intro?
No, that's perfect. And I think it's important to have these backgrounds highlighted when we have these discussions. So when people are listening, they know, hey, there's a lot of experience that comes with what you're saying. We were kind of quipping before we went on air about, some of the LinkedIn experts and stuff that you see out there. There's always a critic, there's always an expert, there's always someone that woulda, shoulda, coulda.
Sure.
But the real world doesn't operate like that. And while I do find tons of value in places like LinkedIn, sometimes it can be a little frustrating as well. But that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. So I got to touch on a few of those things. Number one, going all the way back to Eagle Scout. Um, scouting, it's undergone a huge change in the last decade, for a lot of different reasons. Some good, probably some not so good. But what would you say, like, if it was there was a young person that was listening now, like some of the lessons that you picked up from being an Eagle Scout that have carried with you throughout your career, across your time in the service and your time with the FBI?
No, absolutely, and I have to say it's a profound impact, and I'll say that's the one thing we've talked about in every single job interview I've ever had, from going into the military and different positions to going into the FBI. That was a big discussion we had, and it provided so many opportunities. It gave me the ability to develop a sense of personal responsibility, and a lot of that focuses on preparedness, and like being prepared for my black cat Bean, who really wants to make an appearance today. So we actually have three cats and a Malamute. So if the Malamute jumps up on the desk, that might be a little challenging, and it might be a little amusing for everybody. But that's just it became kind of a core that I centered around the preparedness aspect of it and the personal responsibility into that. As I mentioned, my father is older, so I was very comfortable in talking to adults. As a preteen, young teenager, I was very comfortable with that, and that helped go a long way. I've most
Being
people,
an old
what's one
soul,
of the
huh?
greatest fears is public speaking. You don't want to do that. I had a lot of opportunities to do that. I would speak to, I got my ego at a young age, which was because I was motivated. And literally the week I turned 10 and a half, at that point, that was the requirement. I had to be 10 and a half to go to Boy Scouts. I marched down to Troop 44, Scoutmaster Ray Slavin, said, "Sir, I want to be a part of the troop. I'm here, and I'm here right now." So I ended up, I ended up going through progressing. So I earned my Eagle just before I turned 14. And you typically do that somewhere between 16 and 18. And so I did a bunch of stuff beyond that. I earned a bunch more merit badges and stuff like that. I got into what's called the Order of the Arrow, which is a subset of it's essentially the Boy Scouts refer to it as the honor campers. And I did all that. I went out to Philmont, which is a high adventure base in New Mexico
Yeah.
in 1982, and fell in love with the West and the mountains, and that's kind of knew why I was going that way. But that ability to talk to people, that ability to travel around, meet other scouts and jamborees from around the world, and everything got me really comfortable in being able to talk to people, stand up and say, "This is what I'm doing," and not in any way of an arrogant sense at all, but I felt confident. I enjoyed training the younger scouts and everything like that. So, eventually full circle, I came both, we have two boys, both of them were in Cub Scouts. They did Cub Scouts, and both of them tried Boy Scouts a little bit, but it really wasn't their interest. I was a Scoutmaster for 5 years. That was kind of how kind of brought that on, and I love doing that. And at that point, as you mentioned, the Boy Scouts has changed significantly. Um,
And they just changed their name. I think they're no
yes,
longer called the
yes,
Boy Scouts. It's called like
yes, yes. So
Scouting
now, so
America or
now it's
something.
Scouts. I feel I'm very unhappy with how that's transpired. I absolutely understand wanting to give everybody else the opportunities. The Gold Award in Girl Scouts never got the respect that it deserved and things like that. But I feel like the Boy Scouts they've had some challenging times, and they've really tried to make everybody happy. And I think in the end they've made nobody happy. So you have a lot of hysterical people like me that have been in the Boy Scouts for a long time, love what they've done for us, love the exposure to meeting different people and different skills and everything through all the merit badges. So I'm not happy with how it's transpired. I understand why. I absolutely want to give everybody the same opportunities. So I think you got to take the good with the bad, right? I think the opportunities that Scouts still provides to youth, there's nothing like it. I've seen some other groups that try to essentially resemble, what Baden Powell put together way back in the early 1900s for that. I think they all fall short because it is something that's near and dear to me. I am, as you can tell, I'm a very proud Eagle Scout. I talk about it all the time to this day and everything like that. That was one of the things I felt, young in my life, was something I had achieved, and it gave me motivation to continue to go and continue to develop. So I try to help other. I enjoy. When I was a supervisor, I enjoyed working with young agents the same way. Whether it's scouts, young agents, you want to work on developing people's individual skills, their level of expertise, their level of personal responsibility. And I also want them to be prepared, right?
There you go. That's what I was waiting for you to get to that. Be prepared. That's the theme because being prepared is that's most of the battle. And I think some of the when we get into the part where we talk a little bit more about active shooter response, I think the easy observation is that where you see a lot of people get into trouble is they're not prepared. And even though they understand and they recognize deficiencies, they prioritize maybe and these are my words, I guess, but sometimes I think we prioritize more trivial things. We focus more on equipment and technical solutions to things that are really people problems. And you
Yeah,
have
we,
to.
we like to spend money on gadgets, on equipment that are going to solve our issues. And I'll say, one of the things, I was never a firearms instructor with the FBI, but I consider myself very firearms oriented. I consider myself a gun guy. So one of the things I've done since I've retired, I've been out to Gunsight Academy in Arizona a few times. Absolutely first rate, easily comparable to the level of instruction and instructors that I received at the FBI Academy in that. And really, I think it's about accepting some level of personal responsibility. And I think honestly, you need to be what I term as a student of the gun to be able to use these tools and not just rely on the tool, but it's the operator behind the tool. And that's what a gun is. That's what a weapon is. It's based on the person behind it, the capabilities of that. And people too, we want a quick solution. We want to buy what's gonna do everything for us, as opposed to what's up there really being the main factor. And I think that's again back to the personal responsibility. If we go out and we buy tourniquets, we buy an individual first aid kit, and everybody should take a stop to bleed class. Let me tell you,
Yeah.
both my boys know how to put on a tourniquet by the time they turn 8, and they're both in college right now. Both of them have an IFAC kit that they have in their cars and their backpacks. Just because, again, that's the preparedness guy, right? But we don't necessarily, when you go out and buy those things, there's a level of, well, if I buy a tourniquet, I need to understand how to use it. And I don't really know that I think I ever want to use a tourniquet. And we have to kind of work ourselves through the mental aspects of it. Well, I've got resources. Well, I don't know that if there's a traffic accident in front of me, I don't know that I necessarily want to get involved. That's your level of comfort, your level of training, and things like that. It's just easier to push that off and say, well, it's not going to happen here. And that's right. That's one of the big things we hear all the time. Well, I live in a nice neighborhood. I live in a nice area. It's not going to happen to me here. It's not going to happen, where I am, and things like. And unfortunately, in today's world, that is just not true. So you see so many people that kind of move through their day-to-day life. We don't like to get distracted in our day-to-day life. We go to our, whatever, Dutch Brothers, Starbucks, whatever coffee, and coffee is a big part of Glenn's life. Chris Rolnick can tell you that we share a common bond
Oh, well, I'm
with
right there
with
with
that.
you. Yeah.
So yeah, and so we have our routines, right? We'll go to the local, whatever the most convenient Starbucks is in the morning. Well, okay, so if you actually get out of your car and don't go to the drive-through, that's kind of a rarity anymore these days, it seems like. But if you go in and there's this argument brewing, you see this, escalating argument in there. Most of the time, we're just going to sit there nervously and say, "Okay, is my coffee ready yet? Let me get a." As opposed to saying, "All right, this is the situation I should be removing myself from immediately." And we go. And if you're a planner like me, you've got your secondary and you've got your tertiary, coffee sources that immediately at hand. Say, "Okay, this is a time." You think you go back to Gavin de Becker's book, The Gift of Fear. You
One of
are
the greatest
using your
books of all time, by the
oh,
way.
absolutely. Right here, right here. There you go. So,
Yeah.
but absolutely a great um, compilation of things about we need to pay attention to our intuition. And if we can, and that's kind of this is the shortcut to an active shooter situation, is if you can get yourself out of what's brewing, what's on it, get yourself out of there. Get out. Get yourself as far as away of the threat as you can. And but we a lot of times we're on autopilot. We want our coffee, we're gonna go here. We're not paying attention to all those things that impact us around us. And when we could get ahead of that power curve, we end up kind of being overtaken by that when we don't pay attention.
Yeah. And you just to go back a little bit, you were talking, it's the person behind the equipment, and that is the crux of what I try to really impart on this podcast is, the Coptimizer, the cop optimization. The most important piece of equipment that we have is the 6 inches between our ears, right? It's the mechanism behind everything. And I will continue to beat this drum. I've been beating it for 30 years now. uh, I feel like at times, we've taken one step forward, two steps back, one step forward, two steps back, and uh, I could go off on a long list of tangents of where we're falling short, especially when it comes to officer performance, officer wellness. Um, but it's all interconnected, it's all interrelated, and we tend to try to solve problems in silos because it's a neat, orderly thing. Most of us are, somewhat, we're trying to find structure in the world. We're trying to make sense of things. And sometimes that's the way we solve problems is we check a box, we have a solution, we move on. Like and that I think is a big part of what gets us in trouble. We lack creativity, we lack adaptability, we lack versatility, and all of those things. Going back to scouting, just that example of scouting, and you can make the same with, I think, a lot of youth sports and different types of activities. But scouting really, I mean, it really is like it's at the core of Americana. It's like this, and I sadly I think it's something that we're losing in each generation. And I think for everything that every step away from that we take, we're one step towards an unintended consequence. And I think what we're seeing in schools with these active shooter events and workplace violence events is a world full of people that have been raised to expect someone else to solve their problems, and not enough investment in themselves in learning, how what can I do personally to either, number one, extract yourself from the situation, or two, be a productive part of the solution to the problem and not make it worse. So
Well,
yeah,
and I see, and I think it's significant changes through generations, right? And I've talked about how my father was older, but my dad was a cop until he turned 75. He was very fit, and actually he
that's
and
wild.
it
75.
was
Yeah.
he didn't want to hang up the badge, but and the way that had transpired was that a fellow officer, again, he's in a very small department. He was very fit and was still 75, but a fellow officer got in a fight earlier that week with somebody who was high on PCP, and it was a knockdown drag out. And my dad was like, I absolutely hate to admit it, but I would have not survived that fight. It's like, okay, it's time, and I don't like it. And this, in my dad, and this is in the mid 80s. So, my dad, their cruisers were the LTD, the LTD, Ford LTD, kind of the squared
Yeah.
off one and stuff like that. So they would occasionally have issues with shifting into park. It didn't always kind of shift into park. So this is my dad, the same thing a couple of weeks ago, shifted the car into park and a traffic stop. It started rolling backwards. My dad had just gotten out of the car. So my dad ended up pushing the driver's door back forward, so it was actually parallel to the side of the car, just completely bent the door frame back out and had to call the chief. That's the one time he got in trouble with the chief. He's like, yes, Chief, Poland 2 is no longer viable. I'm sorry to say. It's a little air conditioned right now. But so my dad was, I mean, super strong, super fit and everything. But he was like, that was okay. It's time. I have to accept that's something that I would not,
Well,
be able to work my way through.
Yeah, let's use that as an example for be prepared, because this is one of those. Again, it just this discussion came up on LinkedIn the other day in another post where guy posts an image of an AI generated image of this super fit cop, in uniform, has got a beard, and then next to him is an obese,
Mhm.
overweight cop with no beard, and the discussion evolves around, is our beards the issue, or is it our personal appearance? And it's funny because we get into these silly arguments about, what's more important. And I get it. I'm not trying to trivialize professional appearance. Um, but at the core of what we're talking about is competence. Can we have a competent police officer that has a beard and tattoos and still looks good in a uniform? Or do we lack competence because somebody might be overweight? And the truth is like, it could be A or B. You could have someone that is incredibly competent that's obese. You could have someone that's incredibly incompetent that could lift a house. And so this goes back to, really, what are you trying to measure and what are you trying to accomplish? Just the case where your dad being 75 and being concerned about whether he can, win a fight or not. There's a level, obviously, of maturity, but some self-reflection, which is an indication of a high level, a high EQ, where, somebody is able to take that a good third party look at themselves, like look in the mirror and say, hey, where are my shortcomings? What are my deficiencies? Where might my deficiencies become not just an issue for me, but my partners as well? And sadly, what I'll tell you is that I would much rather have a fit 75-year-old with me than a bag of donut 30-year-old that doesn't care. And because both of them, age isn't the issue. It's the ability at that point. Where the 30-year-old doesn't have the wisdom that the 75-year-old has, and he's, you know, unfortunately, and we see this, right? And this was an FBI study, right? 80% of police officers are overweight. 60% are obese. But actually, it's 40% obese. And these numbers are, I think this data is probably 8, 9 years old now. And
It's
then
going nowhere but up, right?
up 20% morbidly obese. And I actually just wrote about this um, last week, and I plan to write more about it. I did a piece on insulin resistance and the first responder. What's driving the obesity issues in law enforcement. But and again, this kind of ties into what I said earlier, but this is where some of my frustration lies is in 2014, the Obama administration, initiated that 21st century policing initiative. We did the first major look and study at policing in 30 years. It hadn't been done since the late 60s. Long, long overdue. A lot of amazing, talented people working on that project. We learned a lot. We got 6 pillars that came from it. And if you ask chiefs today, I mean, and this is one of the first questions I ask when I'm doing different trainings where I'm traveling around. I'll ask people, hey, have you read the document? Nope. People don't read it. And it's like there's a ton of work here, and very few people are reading it. And one of those pillars, the officer safety and wellness, sure, we finally fight and fight and get some recognition to the issue about long-term damage to officers' health and longevity, which, by the way, impacts performance and organizational performance. You can't separate the individual from the organization. And the data over the last 10 years shows that despite this knowledge and despite this higher level of awareness, police officers are getting more obese. We're getting less healthy. Our average lifespan is declining. We're dying earlier. The top 3 things that kill police officers are not related to any of the equipment that you carry, the cars that you drive, any of that. It's cardiovascular disease, suicide, and other related illnesses. And you know that's a huge problem because
Yeah, absolutely.
it just tells us that we're ignoring real, we're just basically burying our heads. We're sticking our heads in the sand. And again, I get it. I was a chief for 10 years. I understand everything is it's not an as much as we like to say either or, you try to be a yes and as much as you can, but
Right.
there's only so much money in the pot and you can only divide it so many times. You have to prioritize and make executive decisions about what you're going to do with the money that you have and the resources that you have. But it's just frustrating to me on a couple levels that leaders still don't recognize that investing in your people and getting them to invest in themselves is going to give you the biggest return on everything else that you do. And that includes your active shooter preparedness and how you're preparing for these types of events, not for if they occur in your community, but when they occur and how bad they're going to be. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. All
And,
right.
and I and I
Rant
think
over.
no, no. Well, it gets back kind of to that, it's not some you can't buy your way out of it. And it requires, an investment in time and an investment, in talking about, exercise, workout, workout equipment and things like that. I take it back to, not only, law enforcement, not only do you need to be a student of the gun, you need to be a student of human nature. You need to be a physical specimen in the positive sense. I think, the more prepared you can be, you need to embrace, things like BJJ, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You need to embrace ground fighting and stuff like that. Where, I think back to my time, even in my time in the Bureau, I think of one very distinct individual. Was He'd be the agent that would show up maybe once every other week or so with a black eye and stuff like that. He did BJJ all the time. And as you look at the issues that where so many officers are, weapon retention, all those things, a lot of that comes back to if you were a blue belt in BJJ, the way you can manage people physically, you have that level of confidence, and that takes, but that all those things, physical fitness, all those things take years to develop. And you see so many discussions, and we've had a couple of those discussions too, just talking about how we're just really starting to scratch the surface of understanding resilience.
Yep.
Both physically and mentally, from the military to law enforcement. Unfortunately, our very painful experiences around are starting to educate us a little bit. I remember back in, gosh, this was back 2010-ish, something like that. The Bureau had a program out of their behavioral sciences unit, was called Bestow, was Beyond Safety Towards Officer Wellness. I remember they came out to Portland, and the supervisor from BSU, that actually it was his program had developed, it came out to talk about resilience back then. And I know a couple of my retired Bureau friends, Susanna Hasney and Jim Kiesling, that's what they do. They train, they reach out, and they're training on resilience because we're understanding how much of a life-changing impact that has. And so that, you start to talk about that, and that addresses partially the physical fitness. It definitely addresses the mental fitness and mental fortitude, because that was always the thing, right? When I retired, you'd look around to other officers that are retiring. Typically, your type A person retires. What was kind of the thing that was happening? It was either suicide or a heart attack within 6 months, because they didn't have the cardiovascular fitness, they didn't have the mental fitness and the mental resiliency, and they didn't have a purpose anymore. And I remember, very distinctly, not too long ago, another retired friend of mine said, "Hey, what I miss is being around Type A people." And I understand, and I have to say, I'm lucky in the fact that working with the Active Shooter Prevention Project, I'm surrounded by Type A people. I am surrounded by people that motivate me and that excite me, and continue this passion I've always had for preparedness and things like that. But it's that mental aspect. It's not, you can't buy your way out of that. And I think that's one of the challenges we don't understand. Not only job impact, but life impact of how important that is. And so it's hard to prioritize those when you've got that limited budget, right? And so where do you invest now in the future? Do you invest now? I mean, back in the day, my father, you'd work one place for 30, 40, 50 years. Even now, I spent 10 years in the military, 20 years in the Bureau. I was still part of that. You spent an entire career somewhere. You didn't bounce. So you don't really have that currently. You have somebody that works for an agency 4, 5, 6 years, goes to somewhere else. And I see, like, with smaller agencies here, I'll use some of our local agencies, you have all sorts of opportunities for overtime, right? Um, and that's kind of a consistent behavior for officers and deputies that, hey, they like the paycheck, but at what cost in the mid to longer term? I see officers that they're burned out because they're working so many hours because their agency needs it because they're down on people, but they like the paycheck because it helps them buy some toys and stuff at home. But what's the psyche? And then also, to the officer safety aspect of it, what's your situational awareness? When you're working so many hours and you're just, you're doing a double shift and things like that, your situational awareness, which is paramount. And how many times are we seeing, you see the officer the other day that was sitting in his car on his way to work. Somebody walked up and shot and killed him. Yeah, I take back to my own personal history. I remember the very first law enforcement funeral I went to. I was a Boy Scout. I was like 14 at the time. Went with my dad, and it was Rich Becker who was called to a suspicious person outside a bar. He drove up to the bar, walked around the back, and took a shotgun round just inside his vest.
Yeah.
And of course, I've been to far too many law enforcement funerals since then. But it's the ability to put all that stuff together. And so, when you see, and it just as it popped into my mind, and we're kind of going all full spectrum here, right? As we kind of figured it out.
The way
But
these things
I
go,
see,
man.
the officers in cars getting shot in cars. I absolutely do not understand from the bigger sense, why every law enforcement vehicle does not have something like clear armor on the windshield, on the side windows, and something like that that provides ballistic protection, because it's not a rare event anymore. I understand there's cost and things like that, but that's one of the things, with this whole active shooter prevention project. I see solutions. I see things that can help people. A lot of it, again, is that 6 inches, as you alluded to, but there's a lot of resources out there. And the same thing applicable to law enforcement. You can have cameras from your in-car cameras. With you apply a layer of AI, behavior detection. It can tell you if somebody's walking up to your car, and there's some of that technology that's
It's
inherent
coming.
in
Yeah.
some of the most recent cruisers and things like that. But there's a long way to go, and that's yet another competing interest for those dollars. You got to protect them in the near term to get them so they can be sustainable for the long term. How's that for a wide-ranging answer for you?
Yeah, right. Well, and what you just did right there was highlight the challenge that law enforcement leaders have today, knowing like, okay, here's the amount of money that I have, and I don't get any more. So where do I spend? Do I buy ballistic panels for the door for my officers? Put them in every door of every squad car. And the coating on the windows. Do
Right.
we tint windows to in order to kind of defeat that purpose where someone can't approach a squad car not knowing for sure what's in there? But if we tint windows, how many additional crashes will we have at night because officers can't see out?
Right.
You get into all these discussions and trying to find value in the spend. But at the core of it, right, it's still the 6 inches and in between the ears that make the difference. It's how we think our way through. But I'll present to you another use for technology and kind of one of the unintended benefits of using advanced AI in things like automated report writing tools. Oftentimes people, they're thinking about like, how do I maximize the efficiency of an officer because I'm down, I'm down 20% of my workforce. but the calls for service are still up, 10%, 15% year over year. So I have a higher demand for services and fewer people to be able to meet that demand. So are there technology solutions that are available to me that can help me close the gap until I can find more people? But if you have a tool that automates some of these manual processes, and again, this is where I challenge leaders. It just because a technology solution might be inexpensive or less expensive and easy to use, or maybe the rollout process won't be as a big of a challenge. Is it really going to advance you into the future, or are you just meeting the status quo? Because if an officer, generally what happens is when people drive by, and I used to get this in our Citizens Academy all the time, or complaints that would come in, like I've seen this officer sitting at the corner gas station for 2 hours and hasn't done anything. And then you
Right.
look and it's like, well, that's because he's typing an OWI report or a robbery report. He's trying to get caught up on the paperwork that he's got to get done before he can go home from his shift. And people see what they want to see ultimately. But
Sure.
but for that officer that's sitting in the car like that, I that puts them at additional risk. Yeah, I want to be out in the public. I want to be seen. I want people to know that we're out here. At the same time, if I'm staring at a computer screen, typing a long report, doing administrative functions um, that technology could otherwise do for me, then I'm adding risk to an officer's safety.
Sure.
Sadly, it's unfortunate that we have to think this way, but again, this is why I really strongly encourage community members to participate in their police departments, citizens academies, outreach endeavors, anything that they're doing to try to raise awareness to the public about what officers are doing with their time. And conversely, um, I think law enforcement leaders also need to take a much harder look at what they actually are doing with their time. What's driving value for the agency? Are you making a difference in what your core values are and what your mission is, or are we just busy being busy? That's a whole nother tangent. So I do want, but it's all connected to what we're going to talk about now. Just if we can get into it a little bit, sadly we're sitting here today, this not knowing a few weeks ago when we were chatting about what we would talk about on this episode, but we've had another school shooting. Two students dead, two teachers dead. I think it was nine others wounded in a school in Georgia yesterday, and um, yeah, rinse, wash, repeat. And this is kind of what's happening. And I think the big takeaway that everybody listening should have, and maybe some of the questions, if you're listening and you're not in law enforcement, or even if you are, is some of the questions for yourself, if you're in leadership, or uh, for some of your partners that might be in leadership, like are we checking boxes when we're preparing, or are we actually preparing? Are we doing things that are going to make a difference when that moment comes? And if you're doing things like you mentioned, if you're focusing on your ground fighting, maybe it's becoming a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. If you're becoming a student of the gun, if you're becoming a student of human behavior, if you're doing these things, then you are moving towards a higher level of preparedness for an active shooter event. If you're showing up, doing the minimum amount necessary, just trying to get by, just trying to get through day to day, then you're a liability and you're a disaster waiting to happen. And luck is not a strategy, hope is not a plan.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. And it's, I mean, there's just so many things to unpack here with this, and it is a continuous challenge, and I see from yesterday's horrible incident. I mean, you see that actually there they had actually put in place very recently an emergency communications, which was actually utilized system that was actually utilized in that. But when it comes down to it, is that part of, and I have to say, I honestly don't know. for this particular situation. Is that part of an overlapping, multi-tiered, comprehensive security plan? That was a communication system they literally just put in place a week ago. But at the same time, you have a student who's was able to get a gun into the school, was stopped from accessing his coming back into his classroom, with it because the students was going to open the door, saw him standing there with a gun. There's a lot of technologies out there. Skyla is the AI system that we work closely with, that can absolutely identify weapons. It can identify behaviors and things like that. Being very much wants to participate in our podcast today, so apologies for that, but thank you for participating, Bean. Um, but it's how much of that is check the boxes, and I think it's security is tough, right? Having those comprehensive things, we want to get to somewhere where we can, hey, we've had our lockdown drill, we've checked that box, we have our plan, but it's security planning is a continuous thing. And really, one of our primary focuses, the Active Shooter Prevention Project, is exactly that prevention. And it's all about educating people, about teachers, students, parents, community members, about indications of violence. As you see, and what we see so much when we dig into the backgrounds of these school shooters, we see so much of what we call leakage. So many things in the past, so many potential threats that were evaluated in the past, potential for this, potential, and somebody's like, yeah, everybody knew, go back to everybody knew that was, we called him the school shooter online and stuff like that. You see all those things where we don't have robust education about concerning behavior, and specifically concerning behavior. If somebody's, as Chris will always say, if somebody tells you they're going to shoot somebody or do something like that, you need to believe them. It is this day and age, you cannot discount that. And we
Right.
need to recognize if somebody is talking to other people about studying Columbine or any of these other previous school shootings, that's a huge red flag that we need to address. Now, I understand shortage of social and mental health resources around the country, around the world, honestly. But we need to take action when we see these things and try and get ahead of that power curve. There are reporting systems. I'm always a huge proponent of reporting, of very robust reporting systems for concerning behavior, and we need to make it easier for people to report that, and we need to educate them why they need to report those type of things. We're not, the old school terminology. You're not narking on somebody. I want to get somebody some help. I don't want to respond my way out of an incident. I want to prevent an incident. And it's hard to collect statistics on that, right? Because
Yeah.
back to the time in the bureau, it's like, okay, how many acts of terrorism did you prevent? How do you document that? How do you say this is what we really want to do? But you don't necessarily advertise that, because there's just reasons you don't do that, right? But it
Yeah.
is, security is just a
For the same reason you don't
continuous.
let you don't let opposing teams in a college football game record your practice or record your games and steal your call signals. We get
Yeah,
all
right.
upset
Yeah,
about that
yeah.
in college sports and professional sports, and there's rules about it. But then people want us in public safety to broadcast our playbook. Like, here's what we do and here's how we do it. Like, anyone that's got half a brain isn't going to use that when they're planning. So,
Sure. And there's so many. I mean, on the law enforcement side, we study these incidents, really with two primary purposes. We study these to, one, figure out how we can more efficiently, effectively respond, how cops and firefighters can better communicate and be more effective in a rescue task force and things like that. But we also study these to understand how somebody was moving along that pathway to violence, and how can we educate law enforcement, educate threat assessment teams to, here's where we need to, this is where we need to focus on it. And I don't know if the school in Georgia had a threat assessment team, if they had a robust threat assessment team, how that worked. I don't know if they had a reporting platform. But those are the kind of things that we need to really focus on, I think, to get to the prevention aspect of that, because that's where we can really and truly make a difference. But that's that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, was whether it's a little bit of the, the big brother aspect of it. We don't want to get people in trouble. We don't want to put this student on a list. And my wife's a school teacher. She's been a school teacher, teaches high school now, math and science. She's been a teacher for 23 years, and she's seen all these type of things. And you see, even from, I think from a leadership aspect, from when you get to the school district, and I don't mean to pick on schools, it's applicable to churches, it's applicable to businesses and everywhere. But if you have a superintendent, a lot of times, my old thing that I'm used to is the superintendent says, "Hey, I've got a budget for security. I'm going to go out and buy 400 cameras for the district." Okay. Um, did you hire somebody to watch those cameras? Do you have any infrastructure in place? What if somebody sees something on a camera? Well, they're all just inevitably just documentation
Right.
after the fact, evidence documentation. Whereas, now technology is great, and I'm absolutely I still have in my car, I've got some technology in my car, but I also have a whiteboard and some pens and stuff like that. So when the technology doesn't work, I've got a backup. I know up here what needs to get done. If I can use technology to help with that, great. But I need to have that backup plan if that technology doesn't work. But there's like I said, I mentioned Skyla before. It's a great artificial intelligence technology, and essentially Skyla is such a capable neural network that you can essentially take a camera and train it to look for anything you could train a human to look for. And that's really the true power of artificial intelligence. And you see a lot of these platforms out there, they're not true neural networks. They're a big database of images. So you're essentially doing pattern recognition, which is truly at the scientific level is a different approach to that. But you can identify those, the behaviors. You have issues with students vaping and things like that. You can actually address that. And there's a variety of sensor technology that can address that. But when you get to the management levels, how do you treat that? To when you do a lockdown drill at the school, what does the principal do? Do you and I've done this as a first responder public safety. We would go, and when a school would have a lockdown drill, we would go there and walk the school, go through, see which doors are unlocked and stuff like that. You open the door and you see that. And how many times does this happen? The teacher says, "Turn the lights off. We're going to be quiet, but I'm going to keep teaching because I have a whole lot of material that we need to get through, and I have no time to get it done in. So this is really not worth my time. I need to continue." And it's sort of that approach of how do you what are you modeling for your students? You're not modeling to take things seriously. And this is actually truly you're thinking through this in advance, having a plan in advance of what you're going to do is what's likely going to save your life in the future. I've got things I've got to do, and that starts at that management level. How do we, from critical incident management, how do we address that as a manager? How do we model that for our employees? And the same thing is true with law enforcement as well. And that's, you know, the watershed moment of Columbine back in 1999 said, "Hey, we are not the way to address this issue is not to surround and call out the tactical team." And so that all of a sudden, fast forward, decades later, we still haven't really learned that lesson in a lot of places. Is that takes that responsibility and it
Hey,
puts
let me ask you,
the yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but I want to jump in. Why do you think that is? Why do you think even after 2 decades, we we can't seem to get that part right? We have examples of where we have gotten it right. Don't get me wrong,
Yes, absolutely,
but
absolutely. And
why do you think some agencies, some response, some leaders default to an old paradigm?
and I think it's a lot of it is we like buying gadgets. We like giving ourselves tools, that's easier to do, and I think even in my time in the bureau, when I first got into the bureau, you got your view car that was maybe 30 years old at that point. You had the yellow 2D cell flashlight in the glove box that the batteries were so corroded you couldn't get even the bottom of it off to replace the batteries. You had maybe a couple band-aids in there to, later we've all issued IFACs. We were given, some annual first aid trauma training. I'm the preparedness guy. So I have like 8 tourniquets in my car. I have like 3 in my backpack. I carry one in my pocket every single time I leave the house. It's that kind of stuff. So we like those gadgets, but those things are helpful. But at the same time, we need to educate our line officers and deputies about, we need to empower them and educate them that, okay, now you're the tip of the spear. If something happens, this is your singular mission. And at the agency management level, I think we've done a disservice, especially to middle-sized to smaller agencies where budgets are a huge driver of what you can do day to day, and educating the command staff on how to be command staff. I mean, we actually, Sherman Block Institute here in California Post and things like that. You have a variety of those things, but we've got to be more effective when it gets down to where the rubber meets the road. And we've seen that in so many of these incidents where there's a lack of initiative, there's a lack of confidence in those initial responding officers, and that starts at the top. You've got to be able to train, and it's easy to buy stuff, right? It's hard to train people, and people are different. We don't all necessarily take that training very well, and I do think people talk about the challenges of militarizing law enforcement. We get all sorts of resources, from MRAPs and stuff like that, from DoD and night vision goggles and NVGs and stuff like that. But so there's a little bit of aspect of that. But I think it's kind of the commanders. You have essentially kind of a paramilitary role. You are sending your officers, deputies, agents into harm's way on a daily basis, and you need to be able to have the confidence, the training to be able to do that, and then to step right in as part of it. Okay, here's my officers, we need to do this. And unfortunately, that's law enforcement. There's times it's going to be a bad day. You took that oath, you're wearing that badge, it's time. I take this right back to where my dad was, when he was 75. He's like, somebody calls 911. I don't even know if we had 911 at that point. But if somebody calls 911, I'm the person, it's my responsibility to save them if
Yep.
they need help. I'm the person they're going to call, and the buck stops here. And I see the challenge, especially with senior leaders in the smaller agencies, don't necessarily have great opportunities to receive training. So I think that mental fortitude training is something we need to jump on a lot more with command staff. And I think that needs to be something that's part of the interview process, and
Yeah.
talking through some of those things to say that this is, you are, and we see some of these, and I'm thinking through different things. And one of the books that we talked before that I wanted to mention is a book by a gentleman by the name of Scott Heiderkon. Scott is a retired Army Ranger, spent 20 years as an Army Ranger, spent 20 years as a SWAT operator as well. And the book he's written it's called the Active Shooter Response Training Manual. And there's several different sections in there. This is literally, if you have no idea, I can have it right here. If you have no idea how to do active shooter training for your department, buy this. Look at that, and you'll absolutely be able to set up a first class, world class type
And
of
by the
program. But
way,
it
you
goes
don't have to be a leader to buy that book and read it.
absolutely, absolutely. It is. I mean, and that's applicable to line officers, training coordinators, things like that. There's so many resources in there. And Scott talks a lot about commander's intent or command intent. Commander's intent is kind of the Army phraseology
Yep.
of that. But your level of success for an agency responding to a critical incident, it's that effective command during those first few moments of a critical incident. That's your biggest driver. That's your biggest indicator of success in that. And if we're not willing, I mean, and I'll say there are absolutely chiefs, deputy chiefs, sergeants, watch commanders that are absolutely willing to step into that breach and do it with confidence. But if you can't for your agency is not going to be able to solve the issues successfully. And we need to recognize people, and we need to look at things like that when we're hiring people and putting them in those type of positions. It is a huge level of responsibility. You're responsible to your community, you're responsible to your officers, your deputies, what have you. And I don't think we focus on that nearly enough as we start with young law enforcement officers, deputies. I think we really need to build that along with the resilience, along with all those sorts of things that allow you to behave and act in a true command sense, which a lot of times we kind of associate that with the military, and we see that as a negative in law enforcement, I think from outside law enforcement. No, but in law enforcement, in your situation, you absolutely need somebody who has, ultimate command authority, ultimate inspiration to empower his officers and deputies. Is you act, you take action, you take initiative, and you follow it through. And that's one of the things I don't think we focus on enough.
I think the short answer to your long explanation is a failure to prepare. Um, and we talked a little bit about maybe the last time we were chatting, there had uh, the former chief from Uvalde, Arredondo, I think is his name. He did his first public interview, and in that he was basically saying it wasn't his fault. That they did the right thing. They went to a contain and call out after the initial engagement that they had with the shooter. So, here's I'll just use this as an example of this is where I think the lack of preparedness is highlighted. And this is this is why it doesn't matter what tools you have in your car. Um, what matters is how you work the problem and how you think your way through it and how you react. And if you haven't exposed yourself to a variety of circumstances where you're forced to engage in, call it aggressive problem solving or call it, creative problem solving, then the human default when placed in a situation where you don't know what to do and when fear is a big driver is to do nothing. And in this case, that was the worst thing that they could do. Now, I want to also have a caveat here, just in broad, just in like a general statement. When it comes to officer safety, ambushes on officers, active shooter events, or anything like that, I think one thing that we have to also be more candid and honest with the public about is just say, look, we can do everything right. We can do everything within our power to be prepared and still have what would be considered a failed response because the enemy always has a say. The aggressor always has a say. And guess what? They get first say, and we're always going to be reactive. So if their plan is a good one or even a decent plan, there's a high probability if they have enough determination that they're going to have a level of success in executing whatever it is that their mayhem that they're looking to inflict will be. And so it's always easy to point fingers after the fact and say woulda, shoulda, coulda, armchair quarterback, all these things.
Sure.
But it's also really important to thoroughly analyze and review these things. And for any police officer, whether it's day one on the job or, your 30-year anniversary, every single day, there should be a moment of reflection at the end of your day. Like, hey, what did I do well today? What do I need to improve on? And what am I going to work on tomorrow? And sure, you can set up these things in short and long term. And that's how you prioritize how you're going to use your time. But in short, where the failure happened is that the chief from Uvalde, after they had that initial response, is they defaulted into that contain mode. Here's a hard truth that I don't hear enough people talking about. The sad reality is in that case was, it's easy for us to get frustrated and judge on the outside, but most of the killing was already done in that first 60 to 60 seconds. If we're just being candid. Unfortunately, there were a few lives in there that could have been saved and should have been saved with a change in response. But when we default into what I know or what I'm comfortable with, rather than allowing ourselves to be exposed in the training process to failure, 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 and what I like to say is fail falling on your face, not on your ass. Just keep failing forward, get a little bit better, a little bit better. Then I think had he been in a position where he'd been exposed to a training environment where look, your job is to get the shooter no matter what and get him. And if you have to readjust your plan one, two, three, four, five times, then that's what you keep doing. And you counter assault, you counter assault, you counter assault, right? That goes all the way back to, doctrine from World War. I mean, since the beginning in the history of war,
Sure.
right? So with that in mind, I think that in short is where the failure occurred, and for him to say that wasn't my fault, somebody else should have been in charge, that's just an abject failure of leadership, and
Yeah,
lack
yeah,
of
that's
accountability.
that's just a lack of being willing to take responsibility for that. All these things here, you don't default you default to your level of training. You default to how you train. And in this particular case with Uvalde, they had actually recently done some active shooter training, that he was part of that. And in that training, they said it's likely that an active shooter incident will devolve into a barricaded subject situation, which is not true. So again, you go back to your training.
Yep.
You have things where there was really no pre-plan that was put in place with this. There was no training with all these agencies coming together. And so you default to those things that like, well, this is uncomfortable. This is a new area for me. I'm going to be a first responder. I mean, there's absolutely times when the chief of police, whatever agency, he may be the first person through the door.
Yep.
And maybe that person isn't the incident commander, but there better be a plan in place in advance. Okay, where is incident command starting? It can be from the first firefighter to the first officer. They start out as the incident commander. But you have to go through. You have to train that. You have to understand that is, again, we touched on that earlier. That is the single most important factor to success in incident, is having that command understanding from the chief all the way down to the line officer. What's your mission? What's the command posture? And that command posture needs to say that individual officer needs to take initiative. And that goes all the way back up to the chief, too. And in an active shooter situation, you have one singular mission. That is to stop that threat. And I'll just use some term. You neutralize the threat by destroying, isolating, or blocking that threat. If that first mission doesn't work, you continue with an alternate mission, and that mission is to maintain contact. You continue to harass, shoot, move, communicate until you can stop the threat. You don't stop and go to, I guess I would say, the easy solution, or to the result of our inappropriate training to say, hey, this is a barricaded suspect. So one of the other things we talk about for law enforcement leaders is the biggest thing that you can expect from your surrounding agencies is self-deployment. So you need to absolutely be able to manage those resources. And we talk about the 300 plus officers were there. Well, there was a lot of mistaken communication. People didn't have a mission. I'm here to help. You've got to be
I call that
take the
the
reins to give
the
me what to do.
underdog effect. I
Yeah,
call that the
yeah,
underdog effect.
yeah.
Most people don't know who underdog is anymore, though. Sadly.
I actually remember seeing some of those
Underdog.
cartoons back then. Yeah, exactly.
Here I
But you
come
have
to save the
all
day.
these all all these resources that are there, but without a mission. And that all gets back to training, and you talk about what we saw, and then you sort of have that group think almost. But when
Yep.
we do training, kind of back to your thoughts about training, actually, matter of fact, I was talking to a bunch of senior executives about this yesterday. Is when we do trainings, when we do tabletop exercises to full scale exercises, we absolutely need to do an after action, a hot wash, and an after action review afterwards. Identify one. Well, what I would really hate to do is an exercise where everything worked out. Hey, our response was right on. We were do this. We go and high five each other at the end of the day. Hey, we're all ready to go. That tells me that that's ineffective training, because you're not pushing the envelope. You're not taking the initiative to take that where you haven't done before. You're just doing something comfortable back to that earlier
Yeah.
conversation of checking the box. And these are hard things to do. And I think a lot of these things, these are conversations that we don't necessarily have even across an agency of, okay, what's the command posture, what's the command intent. If any of my officers, any of my deputies are in an incident, this is what I absolutely expect of you, this is what you can expect of me. So it kind of starts from within there. But I also see in the broader of preparing people for active shooter things, I like to see that conversation take place with the non-sworn employees of the departments, spouses, significant others, family members. I think a lot of times as cops, we assume that our family kind of knows what I'm going to do in a situation, what they should do in a situation. But a lot of times we don't have that conversation. We really need to have that conversation. If I'm at a grocery store with my wife and the boys and stuff like that, something happens, this is what I'm going to do. I don't want you hanging out with me. I want you out. I want, and we don't have that conversation a lot of times because like, oh, well, I'll protect my family, or they'll know what I'm going to do, and they'll kind of key off from there. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunities, and that way it just extends outside, and doesn't necessarily have to be a horrible thing like an active shooter incident. This could be, from a traffic crash, and we need to have those honest conversations. As Chris Grolnick likes to talk about, back in the 70s, we had the duck and cover, and we were ducking and cover under our desk. Why? That's because the Soviet Union was going to nuke us. And we're going to get hit by ceiling tiles and stuff like that. And it was such a horrible thing that I think was easier to talk to because it was such this nebulous thing. Oh, an atom bomb's going to go off, and but this more routine, violent incident impacting you, whether it's at school, whether it's at the library, whether it's at the grocery store. We never talk about active shooter preparedness at the grocery store. So I always challenge people when you go to the grocery store, find three exits, the one you came in, find two more, find the fire extinguishers. They're actually hard to find at a grocery store because the grocery store wants you to think about buying food. It doesn't want you to think about fire. So those things are oftentimes hard to find. A lot of times you'll see an AED. Do they have a stop the bleed kit? Hey, do you have one in your backpack? Can you get back to the Glenn, the preparedness guy? I think, for teachers, anybody in a work environment, my wife she's got her state mandated fire extinguisher in her classroom maintained by, she's in a science classroom. So she's got a couple extra fire extinguishers that might happen to be possibly maybe to be used as an improvised weapon. She's got, some first aid resources, and it's not that the school has provided that. It's that we, the family, have provided that to her. Same thing with the boys in their cars. They've got those things. So we don't like to take that on because hey, the school should buy this for me, or the agency should buy this for me. How much have you spent personally in your career? Do you have that box of holsters that we all have sitting in the garage somewhere of the different holsters we've tried, or do you have the knife? I have my M3 tactical Schaefer security knife. So here you go, Greg Schaefer. Here's your knife. Right here, how many of those knives, things like that, do you have around? How many flashlights? I drive my wife nuts with first aid kits, fire extinguishers, and flashlights because they're everywhere and they need to be. And we don't take that on, but we were pretty comfortable having the conversation about, well, if the Russians bomb us, and blow us into oblivion, you got to get under your desk. But we don't have those hard conversations with kids today, and I think we absolutely can. I think we have a lot of, and I am going all over the place with this, so thank you for
Yeah,
indulging me there.
I'm gonna reel you in here in a second because I want to narrow in on a couple of those things, a couple of those
Gotcha.
topics.
But we need to have those hard conversations, and we need to talk to kids about critical thinking, and we can, younger kids, you turn it into a game, but I think that needs to be part of curriculum in general, for students and for faculty as well. So there you go. Rant, as you said earlier, rant over. How's that?
Perfect. Yeah. So along those lines, you mentioned a couple times an IFAC, and so some people might not know what that is, but it's basically just a little personal med kit, and people set them up differently. And I'll just give you a perfect example of this. So my oldest son and I, we just went on a backpacking trip up in Isle Royale, up in Lake Superior. I almost hate to say this because it was such an amazing park. Now, just not to get off on a tangent, but they said it's the least visited of all the national parks, but the most revisited. So
Okay.
it's hard to get there. You take a ferry or you fly in a seaplane. That's really the only two ways to get there. But it is absolutely stunning and beautiful. And so my son, who is an Air Force veteran, we had a gear list, and we went through our gear list twice before we left. And as part of that kit was we both carried med kits, which also involved carrying tourniquets. And the question I had for him, because he bought a new one, and I was like, okay, show me what's in it. And now take it out, put it on, put the tourniquet on, show me you can do it. And then I practiced with his, because it was, they're all pretty standard, but they all sometimes just have little different Velcro patches in different spots. And so, the time to practice using it is before you need it. It's it's
Right.
not after, not after you need it. And, so when you're preparing on a backpacking trip, right, everything that you carry with you is weight. And so you have to make these,
Ounces matter.
yeah,
Ounces matter for sure.
yeah, especially when you're getting ready to go 40 miles, with 45 pounds on your back. The shoes matter, gear matters, equipment matters. And so all of these things are just kind of calculations, but I use that as an example. For a lot of people might think like this is more complicated than it really is. It's not. It really is that simple. It's just, think through what are the potential issues that you might run into. Um, like out there, they're pretty clear in a lot of their warnings, right? Like you got to filter your own water. Here are the dangers in that. There are wolves there. There's moose. Um, here, like if you get into a situation where you need medical extraction, you have to it could you might have to self evacuate, and there might not be a plane. It might not be able to get help to you for 1, 2, or 3 days, depending on what the weather is. So when you're getting ready to go out into the backcountry, these are all things that you have to prepare and consider. Um, but it's the same when you're preparing for an active shooter event. And you mentioned some of the technology that's coming around with AI. A mutual friend of ours who's been a two-time guest on the show now is Todd Langley. Todd is the founder of Crisis Response Leader Training, and um, you, the technology that he has, I think, is so brilliant, and it's frustrating to me as someone who adopted it very early. And anytime you adopt new technology early, right, you're going to have hiccups, you're going to have bumps, you're going to have to learn things and help. But the advantage of it is, right, you get to help to develop the product and find out what works, what doesn't work. You get to iterate. But in short, one of the he has the tool that uses a video game engine to help simulate these responses, and it's based, the data, the algorithms are based on real world events, right, from the FBI active shooter database to the um, the trauma surgeons data on wound care, mortality rates, all these things. So the brilliance in the tool that he has, it's not a first person shooter game. It's not designed to be like that. And I think that's sometimes the first hurdle that people run into. But it's really about consequence management. It's really about understanding that every decision you make sets up a whole new table for you. And so now after it's a decision tree. Every decision leads to new options and new opportunities and new challenges. So you've got to work your way through. And if you don't practice that, then when the real thing hits, you're going to have less options to rehearse in your mind. And this is where I'll go back to like someone like the response at Uvalde. They defaulted to an old paradigm because they hadn't done enough rehearsals of what they might or could or potentially do in multiple circumstances. Um, and so, there is an example of a technology solution that is number one, all things considered, it's the most affordable platform out there to train large groups of people. not only can you train your police officers in your department, but your civilians, but then you can throw in your fire department, your EMT, your dispatchers, your school personnel. So everybody gets to train in a virtual environment, make the mistakes in that environment so you can learn from them and build from there. And you can do that all year round. You don't need to set up a $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 training scenario events uh, to get to accomplish really good things in a training environment. Not to say that you shouldn't do those things every once in a while, because this is what I would call a layer of preparedness. It's one thing that you do in addition to your active shooter training, your monthly firearms training, your monthly defensive tactics, all these other things added in. So
Absolutely, and I think that's that hits so many different things that I ended talking. But is having what I call having touch points with things throughout the year is so important. You're integrating it from a school environment. I'll say you're integrating emergency critical thinking, incident response into a day-to-day thing. You don't want it to be just this something you only think about when you have to. And I think Todd's platform is absolutely incredible, but it kind of fits into that niche of, okay, it's actual incident management training.
yes,
And a lot of times I think as managers and commanders and stuff like that, well, hey, I've been to ICS 100, 200, 300, 400. I've done this. This is completely different than that kind of training. This is something you can get into. You've got an hour, you can go and manage this event, and you get to see, okay, well, I'm going to sign an officer here, I'm going to sign an officer here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to request this, I'm going to do this. And then you let the simulation go, and it shows you the consequences, I guess, if you will, of your actions. What worked well, what didn't work well. Well, you did this, but you didn't do this, and oh gosh, now nobody can get there because the cops have parked everywhere, as we always get blamed on, right? We parked
right.
everywhere, and ambulances can't get in. So there's huge value in being able to do that. And it's not just, you don't just turn it on and run the same thing every time. You can customize that all over the place. And I'll say with Todd's a dear friend and a great partner with ASPP. His history is absolutely amazing, and he brings all that into putting together this simulation. You think back to the first time you ever or I ever shot a FATS machine. That
Yeah.
basic simulation. I got to do some kind of cool stuff before that with simulation and technology in the military. I got to spend some time with a real cool CO2 powered MP5 with the naval surface warfare folks a little bit back in the day, but it was so rudimentary compared to what you have here. And with using this as the gaming platform that Todd puts in there, some people are sort of expecting, well, we see great visual displays. I want to see what I see typically in it, but this it's not the platform you focus on. This gives you so much flexibility with this gaming platform. It's a huge resource, and yeah, I wish so many more agencies would embrace that, because it addresses the folks that don't normally do the training. We train the line officers, we
Absolutely.
train the tactical teams. We don't necessarily do a good job of training and continuing to train the managers, and
And
that's
because
that's what
there,
Todd simulation addresses.
yeah, and inside of agencies, right? I was a SWAT guy, right? So I did 12 years on our team. So 6 years as an operator, 3 years as a team leader, 3 years as a team commander. In a mid-sized agency, we trained to NTOA standards and we documented. So we were training over 200 hours a year. And you know, when you have enough call outs, I can't say that we were an overtly busy team, but on average we probably got called out a couple dozen times a year, and now they get called out a lot more frequently now. And in a large part because that was an educational effort on my part to push the use of our SWAT team, not keep them, we train and prepare. Let's utilize them. Not. It's sometimes there was always these budget or fiscal decisions sometimes that leaders made about why you do or don't call out a tactical team. But I digress. The important thing is when you operate in that environment, we'll use NIMS as an example, right? Okay. Okay, I understand what a TOC is. I've worked in a tactical operation command. I know what, the command post is. I know I have an active participation in the incident command structure, and I practice it all the time. But for someone that doesn't come from maybe a negotiator's perspective or tactical background, a detective or an officer that might not work in that environment, they might not ever get that practice to work, to implement, anything from an ICS perspective. So for them, this is all like very intangible stuff. And when I mean, let's be honest, right? NIMS and ICS training is like watching paint dry. Um,
The
you know
second
that
time you watch it dry, yes.
Yeah, I mean it's not that is difficult training to sit through. It's very important, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I mean it's a dynamic learning environment is what Todd has brought to this area. And I mean, yeah, I don't want to just talk about his tool because I think it is very valuable and people can learn from it. The frustration that I get sometimes is the thought process and behind why we don't need that, or why we would focus maybe on something that's just not going to drive as much value. And I always try to look at things from a value perspective.
And I'll say too, I think that's indicative of one of the challenges I see in general when you talk active shooter response. And this is one of the things when you do training, we try to absolutely um, correct this. And people have that mistake. Well, I'll be okay. I just need to wait for somebody to come save me. And
Yeah,
we need to train that mindset to be the exact opposite of that. I want everybody in an active shooter incident. Okay, what am I doing right now to save myself? What have I put in place for options, for resources for me? What plan do I have up here where I've thought about in advance that I have these resources? And what am I doing? When the cavalry shows up, the cavalry will show up. Great. But I am completely in control of what I'm doing right now. So that's kind of that it's that mindset. It's the I'll take you back to your example about what you were preparing for your backpacking trip. Once I retired from the bureau, I got to spend a couple years on the local search and rescue team up here, um, which was kind of humbling at my age. At that point, I was 54 or 55, trying to chase the 26-year-old search and rescue volunteers up Mount Talac, 9,000 plus feet up there. So, but ounces matter, and I've always been a backpacker, so ounces do matter. But back to my time as scoutmaster in the Boy Scouts, that's the first thing boys we'd be getting ready for some of their first backpacking trips or first something with some hiking involved. They've got a survival kit. That's one of the requirements you got to have. Your 10 essentials. Back to the 10
right.
essentials, right? And we kind of talk how that's morphed over the years, especially with map and compass and every. Got to know how to use a map and compass. Don't just rely on your GPS. The little ad there, but I would make the scouts get out their survival, and you could have the best survival kit, have a great survival kit from REI or other, but if you don't pull it out, you don't know what's in it. And inevitably to have, depending on what your environment is, whether it's winter is a big thing here in Tahoe, right?
Right.
Summer is also a big thing if you're not used to the altitude and stuff like that. So you got to pull those out, understand what everything does, and you're going to repack your survival kit with the things that you want to have in there. The IFAC is the same way, and the IFAC is individual first aid kit, tourniquet, some hemostatic gauze, maybe some trauma shears and things like that you absolutely have to understand. And these are all tools, from high tech like Todd simulation, which is great for public safety people as well as churches, schools, for that type of administration. We don't train it collectively between public safety and administrators of businesses, schools, and churches together nearly enough so we can work effectively. But again, it's very wide ranging because there's so many different things you touched on it, and I'll go just real quick and I'll bring this part. Thought to a close is when you're talking about getting ready for your backpacking trip. One of the things I always say, first aid training is one of the best things you can take. It's cheap, it's effective. It's one of the best things that can save your life in so many different situations. I actually recommend, if you can, take a wilderness first aid or a wilderness first responder course, because not only does that teach you first aid elements of it, it teaches you the ability to improvise. and identify when you're in the backcountry, what's a true, we might need to request a medevac, an air evacuation, something like that. Oh, by the way, how do you communicate with a helicopter? Do you know the basic principles of how to communicate to an air ambulance and things like that from the ground? And those type of things, it teaches you to improvise. And that's a lot of it is about you have to have options. And this kind of gets, back to, what resources do you have put in place in the first place? What resources do you have up here? Plan A is not going to work. Plan A is going to change. You need to have plan A, B, C, and D, and understand that it's going to change. And you have to have that flexibility. And the same is true for law enforcement. Every traffic stop, I think, kind of back to some of our first discussions about, having that command posture, command presence at a very physical level interaction during somebody that wants to fight at a traffic stop. If you let that go on and you don't take very positive control of that, it's not going to go well, right? It's going to be much harder to reel in. And it's we don't necessarily want to train to that. We don't necessarily want to go through the hard things of training, but having those resources, understanding those resources, and capitalizing on thinking kind of, I would say, is thinking like an emergency manager, but thinking like somebody who is what? Prepared. That regardless of what the incident is, I've got situational awareness so I know what's happening around me. So I'm already thinking about a plan. You don't have to be the quintessential law enforcement officer that goes to a restaurant with the family and sits in the booth in the back where they have, eyeballs on every exit and they don't have their back to anybody and everything like that. But if you integrate those basic principles of I need to have a plan, regardless of where I am at, and that's true for law enforcement. And anytime you can repetitively do training towards that end, you're going to be so much farther ahead, if that makes sense.
Yep, it does. And so you just mentioned a couple things. I'm going to give a couple of book recommendations just based on what you said. Uh, Michael Easter's book, Do Hard Things. I don't know if you've read that, but it's fantastic. Um, and then another one, and I've talked about this one pretty frequently, and I've written about it in the past, but Michelle Walker's book, The Gray Rhino. If anyone has ever read any of Nassim Taleb's work, and in terms of he's the one he wrote the Black Swan, and he talks about Black Swan events and stuff. But Michelle points out that most incidents are not Black Swan events. They're predictable and preventable, and so that should ring a few ears if you've ever been to any law enforcement training. Oh my gosh, I'm about ready to forget his name, but
You get Colonel Grossman.
no, it's not Grossman.
Bulletproof mind.
It's Lexipol.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
oh my God, total mind blank. Sorry. Anyway, Gordon Graham.
Glasses.
Jeez, I knew
Grant
it was
Gordon.
there.
Yes. Thank
Yeah,
you.
he's
So
got
yeah.
this kind of funny way of saying, uh-huh.
The
Well,
glasses and the old school overhead and the old school grease pencil. Yes.
yeah, right on. All right. Hey, okay,
Heck,
so we're at 90 minutes now, maybe even a little bit beyond. So we're gonna have to wrap up episode one here with you. Uh, um, and like so many of these conversations, I want to keep going, but I also want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time. So I think the theme of the day is be prepared.
yes. And
I think if I were to sum everything
that
up, be prepared.
it absolutely sums up. And I appreciate it's been great conversation. These conversations are wonderful, but you can tell that both sides are extremely passionate about these things. And I hope the people watching this, you should hopefully have several takeaways from this thing. Do you have that IFAC? Think about taking a course and things like that. So hopefully we've given you some things to think about, because that's really what at the heart of what we're trying to do is to get people to take that preparedness thing to heart, like has been, a thread throughout my entire life. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been great discussion today. We could go on for another 6 hours, but thankfully for everyone, we're not going to.
Yeah, just remember, right? The life you save may be your own. So
Absolutely.
if be prepared. Let's embrace the old scouting model. I don't know if it's still going to be the motto or not, and I don't even want to go down that road right now because I fall in your camp. You know, sometimes we ruin good things, and everything goes in cycles. So hopefully that's not the case. But all right, but you already mentioned one book. Can you mention that one more time for people that are looking for active shooter response? And then also, if people have questions for you, they want to bring you in to train, how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. Also, so first, again, the gentleman's name is Scott Heiderkon, and the book is Active Shooter Response Training from Lone Wolf to Coordinated Attacks. It's actually the second edition came out in 2021, and it is a great training resource if you don't know from how to move officers tactically to how to train your executive management to how to put together a training program. It has all that. There's training videos that accompany with that and everything. I will send you the link to that. So if you have show notes or something like that, you can put that in there. I'm again part of the Active Shooter Prevention Project. I'm the executive director. I have my own company as well. My company is TBR Consulting, which stands for Train Be Ready. So that's my website. It's trainbeready.com. And the Active Shooter Prevention Project, the website, it's www.asppro.com. It's kind of a mouthful. But if you Google Active Shooter Prevention Project, of course, the internet can take you everywhere. Those are basically the best two ways to get a hold of us and what we do, and speaking and training and doing assessments. And we really do a little bit of everything because everybody needs something a little different, and we really try to integrate security planning, and it's a continuous process. It's like the OODA loop, if you're familiar with that acronym, and I assume many of the people listening to this are. It is a continuous thing, and we just can't say, hey, I've got the plan, I'm good to go. You've always got to be going forward. So with that, thank you very much for the time today. Wonderful discussion. I look forward to continuing it at some other point.
Awesome. Thanks for being here today. Until the next time, everyone, we'll be 1042.